okay? Hilchos Teshuva. The Rambam, before he begins discussing any mitzvah, he has a headline. If you take a look, he begins, mitzvah aseyachas. There's one positive commandment. That the person should be chote, the sinner should repent, lifnei Hashem, v'yisvader, and to do vidui, to make a verbal confession, meaning feeling remorse in your heart, regretting what you did wrong, and you commit yourself never to go back there again. That's not sufficient. You have to verbalize the regret, and you have to verbalize the commitment to the future that you're never going back there. Unless you actually articulate the remorse and the commitment to the future, one does not fulfill the mitzvah aseh of Teshuva. And we'll see one does not have kapara. One is not atoned. Just as an introduction, the Rambam will rule that if one does not make the verbal confession, one does not fulfill the mitzvah, and one gets no credit for doing Teshuva. So the Minchas Chinuch, who's the commentator on the Chinuch, who's a codifier, who's a Rishon, writes, asks a question from Gemara Kedushin. The Gemara Kedushin tells us that a man is a Rasha. His classification is evil. And he gives a woman a ring, money, and he says to her, Hareyat mukdeshesli, amna shani tzadik gomor. I'm marrying you on the condition that I'm a tzaddik. He's a Rasha, but he says, I'm marrying you on the condition I'm a Rasha. And we haven't seen in his behavior any change. And she accepts the ring in the presence of witnesses. So the Gemara says, Hari Safik Mukudeshes. She may be married. It's a question why. Shema Hirur Tshuva Belibo. Maybe he had stirrings of tshuva in his heart. If he would have verbally made the confession, we clearly maybe he did tshuva. So what is it a question? He met the condition. The precondition was I'm marrying him the condition that I'm a tzaddik. But we only have a question because he didn't verbalize it. But if he didn't verbalize, the Rambam says it's not considered tshuva. One does not fulfill the mitzvah. So if that is the case, why is it even the suffix? Even if he had stirrings in his heart of tshuva, we don't value that, and he's still classified as a Rasha. That's the question of Minchas asks on the Rambam. So he says something very simple. A person is a Rasha, and he says, I will turn over a new leaf. I will no longer behave as a Rasha. Immediately, he's reclassified as tzaddik. He's reclassified as tzaddik. Why? Because he's made a commitment. He will no longer behave as a Rasha. However, for the purpose of atonement, which is considered spiritual rehabilitation, you have to follow the protocol. For instance, person that inadvertently violates Shabbos. The halacha is one must bring a chatos, he must bring a sin offering. If one does tshuva, verbalizes it, and expresses his remorse, and he will not do it ever again, and he will be careful. The halacha is, the law is, he's not atoned. Why? Because the only way you have atonement, if you violate Shabbos, which carries a very extreme level of liability, you have to bring the chatos, you have to bring that sin offering. Without the sin offering, one doesn't have that reinstatement. But what is your classification? You're tzaddik. You are a tzaddik. Because you said you will not go back to do that again. So the stirrings of tshuva in terms of reclassification, that's a reclassification. So if there's a question, Shema here, tshuva belibo, maybe it's stirrings of tshuva in his heart, that's enough for the reclassification. It's a something because we're not sure whether he had those stirrings of tshuva in his heart. But atonement-wise, he's not atoned. The Rambam speaking about to be fully reinstated, to be rehabilitated, as if you never did the sin, and to get credit for tshuva, that's only if you make the verbal confession, in addition, in conjunction with the remorse and the commitment for the future. That's the answer to the Minchas Chinuch. How he reconciles the Gemara in Kedushin with the Rambam's ruling here that it's only with Vidui. Vidui is vidui peh. Vidui peh means you have to have a verbal confession. The Rambam will say over here in this chapter that today we no longer have a Beis Hamikdash, so we're not able to bring the korban. What's the Mizbach Kapara? Those are the words of Rambam. What is the altar of atonement? The altar of atonement is Teshuva. That's our altar of atonement. So the Teshuva is a place in the Chatos, meaning at a time when you're able to bring the Chatos and you don't bring the Chatos and the sin offering, so you're not fully atoned unless you bring the sin offering. But today that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, what is the equivalent of the Mizbach Kapora, the altar of atonement? Teshuva alone. So it seems from the Rambam, Teshuva today that we don't have the Chatos is the equivalent of bringing the Chatos to the time of the Beis Hamikdash. So they ask on the Rambam from a Gemara in Shabbos, there was a discussion between Rabbi Shmuel and the Chachomim whether you're permitted to read by candlelight. The Chachomim say one should not read by candlelight unless you have somebody actually supervising you while you're reading. Why? Because when a person becomes immersed in what the reading material that he's reading, inadvertently he may manipulate the wick. And if he manipulates that wick while it's burning, you're in violation of Havora, of kindling. So the Chacham say, therefore, you're not permitted to read by candlelight, unless you have somebody watching you, supervising you to make sure that you don't touch that burning candle. Rabbi Shmuel says, no, it's not to be concerned. And he says, Ani ekro v'lo eter. He says, I will read by candlelight, and I'll prove it to you, and I will not manipulate the wick. What happens? Rabbi Shmuel goes and he reads by candlelight, and he manipulates the wick, meaning he violated Shabbos inadvertently. There's Rabbi Shmuel, the Tana. So Rabbi Shmuel, after this happens, he violated the Shabbos inadvertently, and ultimately, when he saw what happened, he concurred with the Chachomim. You're not permitted to read by candlelight. He wrote in his personal diary, when the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, Avi Chato Shmeina, I will bring a fat sin offering. That's what he recorded in his personal diary. I will bring a fat sin offering. So they ask on the Rambam says today that we no longer have a Beis Hamikdash. What's the Mizbach Kapora? What's the altar of atonement? Teshuva. So if the altar of atonement is Teshuva, why do Rabbi Shmuel lived after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash? He definitely did Teshuva. So and he did Teshuva, he verbalized, he made a verbal confession. Why did he record in his personal diary, Avi Chato Shmeino? That's the question they ask on the Rambam, from the Gemara in Shabbos. Now, there's a Gemara at the end of Hilchos that cites a pasuk, that the pasuk indicates that although we have no korban today, but when you say Parshas Chatos, it's kilo hevi Chatos. When you say the portion of Chatos, the psukim, and you understand what the words mean, and you understand all the protocols of what's stated in that pasuk, it's kilo hevi Chatos. It's as if you brought the sin offering. Kolam Parshas Ola, when you say the portion of the Ola, it's kilo hikrev Ola. It's as if you brought the Ola offering, the burnt offering. And every one of the korbanos, if you say the psukim in the Torah of that particular sacrifice, it's kilo hikrev. It's as if you brought that. So they ask, if that's the case, Rabbi Shmuel, no question, he said Parshas Chatos. He said the portion of the Chatos. So if that's the case, and the Gemara says in Hilchos, at the end of Hilchos, kilo hikrev Chatos, why did he record in his personal diary, that's the question which is asked on the Gemara in Shabbos. The answer which is given is, it says, Koloma Parshas Chatos, Ki'ilu hikrev Chatos. Ki'ilu means as if. It's if, but it's not quite. I mean, conceptually speaking, if we have a Beis Hamikdash, you have to bring the Chatos. Anything less than the Chatos, you're not atoned. So why now that we have no Beis Hamikdash, you may be onus, it's something beyond our ability, why should it be the equivalent of bringing a Chatos if actually you didn't bring a Chatos? So you have to stop making differentiations. If you're able to bring it and you don't, then you're not atoned. But today that we're honest, we're in a state we're not able to bring it, saying the psukim is sufficient. But if you need that reality, if a person, God forbid, doesn't have an arm and he's not able to put on tefillin, is he credited for putting on tefillin? Well, he has no arm, but still, actually speaking, you have to put tefillin on your left arm. And if you don't put the tefillin on, one doesn't feel the mitzvah of tefillin. So if that's the case, why in Tamid the Beis Hamikdash, atonement only happens if you bring the korban? Today, that we don't have the korban, saying the parsha is sufficient. How could it be sufficient? If you need that korban and the protocols and the avod of the Kohen, the sprinkling of the blood and the burning of the innards on the mizbeach and the eating of the kohanim of the sin offering, only then are you atoned. How does it happen without going through all that? So therefore, they say it's keilu hikriv chatos. It's not literally you've brought a chatos. It's the equivalent. It's keilu. It's almost. It has a semblance of it. But did you really bring the chatos? The answer is no. It's the closest thing to bring the chatos. Therefore, Rabbi Shmuel recorded in his diary, personal diary, Shibana Beis Hamikdash, Avi Chatos Shmeina. When the Beis Hamikdash will be rebuilt, he'll bring a fat sin offering. That's the answer which is given. However, I once said something differently to answer the question from the Gemara in Shabbos. Why Rabbi Shmuel recorded in his diary, Shibana Beis Hamikdash, Avi Chatos Shmeina. What I had said was, now, there's a Chazon Ish. Before I tell you what the Chazon Ish says regarding something else, that a person can do the identical action, and based on one's intent, that will determine the level of liability for that action or no liability whatsoever. If a person does an action and it's done under coercion, he has no choice. He's forced to do it. Although he did the action, he's not held accountable for that action. But since it was an onus, that action is not attributed to himself. What about if he did that action inadvertent? It's his action. Although he wasn't aware, whether he wasn't aware of the law or he wasn't aware that he's even doing the action, but he did the action. That action identifies with him because it didn't happen due to an external force. Therefore, the action identifies with him. He has liability. What's the level of liability? It's shogeg. It's inadvertent. What about if he did the action and it was done with intent? But the intent was not defiance. It was intent was he had a weak moment and therefore he was vulnerable. Therefore, he transgressed. It's more serious and more severe than inadvertent. It's called deliberate. But although it's deliberate, but it's not defiant. What about a person chooses to transgress in a defiant context? That's called pesha. Defiance is even more extreme. So we see the action itself, due to one's intent, will determine the severity of the action, which will determine the level of liability. So the Chazon Ish says that today, the halacha is, the Gemara says that a person's machal Shabbos, called machal Shabbos kilo oved avodah zarah. Person violates the Shabbos, a person is equivalent like an idolater. So Rashi explains the Chulin, once discussed this, that observing the Shabbos is a testament that you believe Hashem is the creator of the world. If you don't observe the Shabbos, then what is it? You're denying Hashem is the creator. As a result of that, the person is considered a mumam chol Torah kula. You're an apostate, like you're rejecting the Torah. It's almost like you don't believe in God. God created the world for a purpose. You say it's irrelevant. So the question is, the Shach rules in Shulchan Aruch regarding Yayin Nesach that if you have a person's Mechal Shabbos touches your wine, a non-Jew touches your wine, the wine is not pasteurized, you're not permitted to drink the wine. What about if a Mechal Shabbos, a person deliberately violates the Shabbos, not inadvertent, deliberately, he touches the wine, you're not permitted to drink the wine. So the Chazon Ish says, what about today's day and age, where even the people know there's such a thing as the Shabbos, but since their capacity to be able to internalize it to any degree and have an understanding of that, it's so superficial, even the deliberate violator, not to a person that had a full Torah education, he's aware of Shabbos, but he doesn't begin understanding what it really is. Although it's deliberate, it's the equivalent of an inadvertent. And therefore, he's very lenient that a person's Machal Shabbos, if he touches wine, Although he deliberately violates the Shabbos, you're permitted to drink the wine. That's the Chazon Ish. Because, even though there's an awareness, but since it doesn't resonate, it hardly resonates with the person, therefore borders on shogeg. And therefore, if he touches the wine, one's permitted to drink the wine. That's the Chazon Ish. We don't follow the Chazon Ish. However, Rabbi Shmuel lived pre-destruction, post-destruction. If you have an understanding of what the Beis Hamikdash was, in the Avodah on Yom Kippur, we say Barak Kohen Gadol. If you were there to witness the Kohen Gadol doing the service on Yom Kippur, it's something, it's not to be described, not to be fathomed. You were touched spiritually in a way we can't even relate to that. So if you lived before this destruction of Beis Hamikdash and you witnessed, it was a different era, and now you violate the Shabbos, it's a different level of violation. Since you have a different depth of understanding what Shabbos is, when you violate now, it's a much more severe transgression. Personally, post Churban, after the destruction of Beis Hamikdash, his level, comparatively speaking, is superficial. For him, saying Parshas Chatos will be enough. So Rabbi Shmuel, who lived before the destruction, where he witnessed and he was exposed to what that was, for him, saying the Parsha of Chatos is not enough. For him, he has to record in his personal diary, Shibanu, he said, Migdosh, Avi Chatos Shmeina. However, for us, the Gemara Menachos today, that we don't have the Beis Hamikdash, and we were never exposed to that level of dimension of spirituality, for us, violating Shabbos, it borders on superficiality. As a result of that, when you say the Parsha Chatos and you do Teshuva, that's sufficient, and that's the equivalent of bringing the Chatos itself. Try to respond. But Alan, is the question.
Rabbi, there's two parts to the kapara, to the atonement, and it doesn't work unless you verbalize it.
Okay.
What is it about verbalization that cements the deal?
Okay. If a person, there's a mitzvah say, positive command to say Kiddush Friday night on Shabbos. Zochas Yom Shabbos Lekacher. What about a person, reads the Kiddush and doesn't verbalize it? Is one Yosei. We rule Hiru Lav Kedibor. Meditating is not sufficient to fulfill the mitzvah. You must say those words. You must say Zochas Yom Shabbos Lekacher. The words that we say, Vayechulu. You must say those words. If you don't say those words, let's say I read the words, you meditated the words, not enough. You say Kriya Shema. You think the Kriya Shema, but you don't verbalize those words. One did not fulfill the mitzvah of what? Of Kriya Shema. You have to verbalize it. So it's the same question you're asking. Why verbalization? Right? Same thing. So I always say that the Torah tells us when Hashem blew the soul into Adam through his nostrils, the Torah says, "Vayhi nefesh chayo." He became a living species. Those are the words. So the famous Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation, says he became ruach memaloler. When the soul was blown into him, he became a speaking species. Speech is a derivative of the neshama. It's an expression of the soul. The only way we're able to express the neshama and the expression of the neshama is words. The reason why man was endowed with speech was because we have to study Torah. Torah has to be studied. The Gemara says you have to articulate the words. The Gemara says, that quotes a pasuk, Chaim hi lemotzi'ehem. Torah gives words to the one who is motzi bepeh. When you articulate, you verbalize those words, that's when the Torah has its greatest level of value. You meditate if you what's a credit studying. But the ultimate is to be able to be impacted and affected, you have to have verbalization. Because speech is an expression of the soul. So anything that has to do with our spirituality, whether it's Kriya Shema, whether it's Kiddush, whatever it is, or the study of Torah, the soul has to express itself. And the expression of the soul is speech. So when we speak about atonement, there's mitzvah to do tshuva. Again, the remorse, the commitment to the future has to be, the confession has to be verbal. Only then is the person's neshama impacted. We failed, To reinstate that neshama, to rehabilitate it, you have to follow that protocol. Only if the protocol is expressed in words, that's why it has that level of effect. But even on a very practical level, the Gemara says in Tainis that if a person studies Torah himself, it doesn't have the same value as if you study Torah and you enter into dialogue with another person. Why? Gemara says, the Torah is a tree of life. Just as if you have an ember, with one lit ember, you're able to light other embers. Identically, when two people study Torah, each person ignites and illuminates the other, because through that dialogue, you come to another level of clarity. Or it says cherev el abatim. It's called cherev. If you have a sword and you want to sharpen that sword, the knife, you take two knives and you run one over the other. And by running one over the other, each one sharpens the other. Identically, when you enter into Torah dialogue, you get another level of clarity. And as a result of that, you bring to another level of truth. I mean, the proof of this, you have an idea and you believe a brainstorm and you're all excited and you want to share it with someone. And you begin sharing with the other person, even before the other person responds, the moment you start verbalizing, you see it's not as perfect as you thought it was. Because the mind is abstract. Verbalization, although it's not an action, but it's more than something which is totally abstract. So when you express it, it brings the mind, what's totally into more of a reality. It brings, and then you begin seeing that it's not. And when the person responds, you may even see that it's even less perfect than you thought it was. So an expression, verbal expression, touches us differently than if we just have it in our minds. The proof of the pudding is a person, God forbid, is grieving over a person who died. And a person is sitting shiva. And you go and you share information about one's parents. You know, whatever you're sharing, you know that it's information you have in your mind. But when you speak about it, it touches you differently. When you speak about the parent or speak about certain events of the past, because speech you touched, even though it's not an action. The Gemara says, "Dibur lav k'maser." Words are not an action, but it's more than something which is totally abstract, and we are touched and affected by what we say.